Okay, today I'd like to introduce a good book to everyone. The title is Miracles of Our Time, the Missionary of Peaceful History. First, we'll discuss the miracle of the stopped tides. In the 1956 film The Ten Commandments, there's a scene where Moses parted the Red Sea, leading the Israelites to safety from Egypt. The miracle of the Red Sea is recorded in the book of Exodus in the Bible, describing the miraculous event of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea on their way to the Promised Land. Exodus chapter 14 verse 21. Moses stretched out his staff to the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to recede overnight with a strong east wind. The waters parted, and the sea became dry land. How exactly did the miracle of the Red Sea, orchestrated by Moses in the Old Testament, come about? Not only the miracle of parting the Red Sea, but scientists have also been striving to scientifically prove the miracles and wonders described in the Bible. Parting the sea cannot be accomplished in an instant. God then commanded a strong east wind to blow for several days, exposing mudflats in the Red Sea. Just as the Israelites needed to cross the Red Sea, the tide receded, turning the sea into dry land, a historical miracle. Later, the same scene occurred when the Israelites crossed the Jordan River. The priests, holding the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, stepped into the Jordan River, and the water stopped flowing. Joshua chapter 3 verse 13. 1 Kings chapter 18 verses 43 to 45 describes the miracle of rain falling on the land of Israel, which had suffered a drought for 3 years and 6 months after Elijah prayed to God. Such a miracle is also in accordance with the laws of nature. Rain is produced by the gathering of clouds. The scriptures record that the clouds at Elijah's time gradually expanded from the size of a palm, evolving into nimbostratus clouds before the heavy rain fell. People simply claim God transcends nature, displaying power and miracles. A God who creates and governs all things is undoubtedly omniscient and omnipotent. But God is like a train running on rails, or the separation of seawater in the waters off Jindo Island, South Korea. This is one such phenomenon. God is the master of truth, law, order, and principles governing the universe, God's history, and order. John chapter 1 verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Therefore, God's power is manifested through the laws He has established. However, humanity often doesn't understand that God's word is like a law, since God has established absolute laws. He will not violate them. That is, the established laws, which is why when we see God do something, we say, "This is a miracle. How could this happen?" However, so-called miracles are not irrationally making the impossible possible. If we understand the truth, we will find that everything happens within the laws established by God. However, these miracles that occur under the laws of nature are not always visible. When God intends to tell people to hear the prayers of the central figures of their time and to work through them, He will show us. This is the revelation of all things. Our era also sees mysterious and amazing miracles, such as the miracle of the tide stopping. The following will introduce an event that scientists around the world are still unaware of. The tide stops on the west coast of South Korea. This event occurred on August 15, 1995. At Mongsanpo Beach on the west coast of South Korea. On that day, the teacher and over 1,500 disciples from Japan and other overseas countries, as well as South Korea, gathered to celebrate the 50th anniversary of South Korea's Liberation Day, holding events to glorify God and conducting youth retreat activities, including swimming, soccer, horseback riding, and volleyball. When the tide recedes at Mongsanpo on the west coast, the seawater recedes by more than 300 meters, exposing the sandy area which can be used as a sports field. It was during the Baekjung spring tide, note, in South Korea, the 15th day of the 7th lunar month is called Baekjeong when sea levels reach their highest point of the year. During this spring tide, around 4 p.m., the seawater begins to slowly surge towards the shore, and nearby residents line up on the beach to dispose of their trash. As the tide rises, seawater begins to flood the shore, interrupting all other sports competitions except for volleyball. The teacher and students, while playing, continuously monitor the tide. Since the entire youth team hadn't gathered for a volleyball match in a long time, everyone wanted to play again. So, the teacher and students played volleyball together on the beach after the tide receded, giving glory to the team. However, seeing the tide continuing to surge in, the teacher felt he couldn't stand idly by any longer and prayed to God. The teacher prayed loudly, "God, this is our annual spiritual retreat. With the lake water coming in, we can't exercise. It's so sad not having a sports field. Please, God, stop the tide." The disciples watching the game, seeing the surging seawater, quickly gathered their strength and shouted, "Tide, don't come in." At that moment, no one in the world prayed for the tide to rise at the Mongsanpo beach on the west coast of South Korea, because no one else needed the tide to stop. Only the teacher was anxiously pleading. After praying, the teacher said to the disciples, "If our prayers are appropriate, the tide will stop. If not, whether it's for exercise or to glorify God, we can only do what we can." At this time, the Seoul team and the Busan team were playing their final volleyball match. The teacher really wanted to spend more time with his disciples, whom he had been enjoying his time together. With this feeling, the teacher did his best to glorify God through exercise. Then a miracle happened. Halfway through the match, suddenly many people exclaimed, "The tide hasn't come in." An unbelievable thing had occurred. Those present thought, "We must be seeing things. Is it possible for the tide to stop?" But after 20 or 30 minutes, the tide still hadn't come in. People found it amazing and walked down to a spot 2,000 kilometers away from the volleyball match, finding that the tide hadn't risen there either. One of the students who was playing volleyball with their teacher at the time the tide had stopped gave the following testimony. During the last volleyball match between Seoul and Busan, my teacher and I were on the same team. If a player on our team made a mistake, my teacher would ask them to leave the court, leaving only 3 of us on the court, including my teacher and me. On August 15, 1995, at the beach in Mongsanpo, the tide hadn't come in, and we continued the volleyball match. At that time, the seawater was slowly surging towards the volleyball court. My teacher, while serving, kept shouting, "Tide, don't come in. Tide, don't come in." He continued to shout this while playing volleyball. However, at that moment, I was more worried about being called off the court for a mistake, and I actually hoped the tide would come in quickly and the match would end before I was forced off the court. I thought to myself, just hold on a little longer. Once the tide comes in, it won't be able to. If we play, the game will end as it is, and I won't have to endure the pain of being kicked off the court. However, the tide never came in. I looked at my watch, it was almost 7 p.m. I wondered, why isn't the water coming in? I found it strange. Halfway through the game, I turned to look at the beach and saw that the tide was still in its previous position. At its normal speed, the tide should have already rushed into the volleyball court around 7 p.m. But seeing the lake water still in its old spot, I was astonished. I then realized the tide had stopped. Because of playing volleyball, I became one of the people who witnessed the miracle of the tide stopping at Mengshan on the west coast. Besides this, there's another thing that can attest to this. Residents who wanted to throw away their trash during high tide couldn't because the tide hadn't come in. At that time, some residents were used to leaving their trash near the beach so that the current would naturally carry it away. However, that day, the tide didn't come in, and the trash from the residents of Mengshanpu remained untouched on the beach. The most astonished by the West Coast tide stopping were undoubtedly the residents who had lived there for decades. At a youth retreat, Park Myung-soon, who ran a bar on the beach in Mongsanpo, said, "I've lived here my whole life, and this is the first time I've seen the beach not full. Every spring tide, it's always full, and we can't play on the beach. But today, even during spring tide, the sea isn't full. It's incredible." Regarding the miracle of the West Coast tide stopping, the teacher said, "This is what the Holy Trinity did. I believe this, therefore God is always with me. The glory and praise that doesn't belong to me should be given to God. This wasn't accomplished by my own power. There are hundreds of accounts in the Bible of God personally descending to help those who love Him. On August 15, 1995, God did just that. He answered the prayers of those who were His time's messengers and descended personally, doing what human power could not do. Stopping the relentless West Coast tide. 2. The miracle of the tide stopping at Port Dickson Beach, Malaysia following the miracle of the tide stopping at Mensanpo. God once again manifested the miracle of stopping the tide. This occurred on the last day of our retreat, September 10th. During our devotional meeting held at the end of August and beginning of September 2001. That day, the teacher began speaking to key leaders from South Korea at 3 a.m., sharing his observations of God's work witnessed during missionary work in Europe from 1999 to 2001. He continued speaking until after 4 p.m. Around 4 p.m., a sudden silence was followed by a strong wind that lasted for 15 minutes. Even chairs placed nearby were blown away and had to be retrieved and rearranged. Looking at the sudden strong wind, the teacher said, as described in the Bible, the strong wind is a miracle proving that God has been here. After speaking to the key leaders from South Korea for approximately 14 hours, the teacher returned to his dormitory for a short while and then returned to the turbulent beach at dusk. It was past 5 p.m., and a dazzling sunset painted the sky. The tide usually reached full level around 6 p.m. at this location. Since it was already past 6 p.m. when they were supposed to listen to the teachings, even if they listened immediately, they could only listen for a maximum of 30 minutes. Therefore, the disciples said, "Teacher, it's high tide now, the sea will be rushing in soon. Should we find another place to listen?" The teacher said, "I have been teaching for over 14 hours today, starting at 3 a.m., and I feel very tired. Actually, I didn't originally plan to teach. But since everyone is gathered here, let's keep it brief until the tide comes in. I will teach, and you can mark a spot and see how fast the tide comes in." The teacher looked at the disciples who were cleaning around and instructed them to insert a bell at the end of the rising tide, along with a wooden stick about 50 centimeters long and as thick as a finger. After observing the location, the teacher walked to a spot on the beach about 7 meters away. The teacher said, "I've spoken many words to important leaders in South Korea over the past 14 hours, and now I don't know where to begin." After saying this, he began to preach, "Look at the earthquakes, storms, and floods happening in various parts of the world. Good fortune and misfortune are not accidental. God is the head of the world and always judges according to the deeds of individuals and nations. Today, God is also traveling the world, blessing those who deserve blessings and judging those who are utterly wicked. If you want to know which country God is judging, you can find out by watching the world news." The teacher continued to preach on this topic. The teacher, completely absorbed in preaching, suddenly said, "Now God has come to the scene and stopped the tide, but no one has noticed." The teacher was the first to notice that the tide had remained stationary and hadn't surged in during high tide. The teacher said, "God has stopped the tide. At that moment, the disciple, absorbed in the words, also looked towards the sea. Upon hearing the news that the tide had stopped, several disciples got up and walked to the beach marked with sticks and shovels. The seawater truly stopped at the spot where the Master had instructed them to stick the sticks and shovels, and didn't come in any further. All the disciples present exclaimed, "It truly is a miracle." So, this is what the disciples witnessed at the scene of the tide stopping at Portsen Beach in Malaysia. This is from Pastor Malone's Facebook page in Malaysia. September 10th is the anniversary of the Portsen tide stopping miracle every year. This year marks the 14th anniversary. A miracle is evidence of the Lord's presence. Therefore, on this second anniversary of 7 years, I bless everyone. May the Lord's fortune and divine intervention always be with you. Amen. That concludes the testimony from the book, The Divine Interpretation of Our Times. I'm sharing this story of the 2 tide-stopping miracles with you today. May you all be safe. Thank you. Goodbye.